¿Qué tal? Saludos, bienvenidos, muy buenas tardes.
Greetings, welcome, good afternoon. We have with us one of the somebody who is among the 100 most important people in the world, according to the Time magazine, the founder of Flickr, who is the most popular place to exchange photographs. The web has changed the way in which we relate with each other and the way in which we understand and consume culture. The future of any organization, any company is in opening up to these kind of webs and bring them along, incorporate them into our business. And to talk about all of this and about the social media, I want you to greet with an applause Stewart Butterfield.
Hola a todos. That's about all my Spanish.
Good morning, everybody.
First, I'd like
Good
to thank
afternoon.
the organizers of FICON for inviting me here. It's a wonderful excuse to be in Spain. Beautiful country, beautiful people, delicious food. So you're very lucky. Remember that. I'm going to be talking about Flickr, obviously. Some of the context for Flickr's success, the reasons why it was successful, some of the lessons we learned along the way, and then a little bit about the broader context of social media, Web 2.0, user-generated content, whatever phrases we want to use to describe what's happened over the last 5 or 6 years in Internet. So this is the current state of Flickr. There's about 80 million unique visitors to the website every month, 4.5+ million photos uploaded every day, 4.2 billion photos uploaded in total. The next one is the one that's most amazing to me, is every second 45,000 photos come off of Flickr's web servers out into the world. It's amazing to me partly because I remember when we hit 100 photos per second and 1,000 photos per second, and the long nights we spent going to the server co-location facility and adding new servers, so long nights with screwdrivers and installing hardware. There's 40 million users registered on the site, and every day we use 14 terabytes of hard drive space to add the photos. What a lot of people don't know, though, is there was some accidental beginnings to Flickr. It wasn't intended, or we didn't start the company in order to make a photo sharing website. We started the company to make a web-based, massively multiplayer game. And it was 2002, so a very difficult time. A very difficult time to raise money. It was after the dot-com crash, after WorldCom and Enron big scandals, after the 9/11 terrorist attacks, and no one wanted to invest in consumer-facing internet startups. So we had this idea to build a game and ran out of money. We couldn't get any investors interested. So we cast around for ideas that we could implement more quickly than building the game, which was a long and complicated project, and hit on the idea for Flickr, which was something we could do with the existing technology that would be faster to complete and we wouldn't have to raise as much money. So that was October 2003. We got the initial idea. It took about 8 weeks or so of debate within the company whether we should start working on this or not. And in December we did. In February of 2004 we launched it. And most people probably don't know, but when we first launched Flickr, it was very, very different than what you see today. Because it was based on the massively multiplayer game technology, most of the activity on the site was about instant messaging and group-based chat. It was very cool. You could drag a photo from your shoebox full of photos into an instant message conversation, and it would pop up on your friend's screen in real time, and you could talk about the photo. But ultimately, a stupid product, a useless product, because the chances that someone you cared about would be online at the same time as you were about 0. So one of the first changes we made in April of 2004 was to add photo streams, which is a lot like a blog or a Twitter stream where the most recent photo is posted at the top and we keep on adding them as you go. In May of that same year, we added tagging, and things actually started to pick up a little bit. With group pools in July, it was sort of the shape of Flickr as it's seen today. And after that, you can see started getting a lot more people using the sites. The 100,000th photo was July of that year, and the millionth photo was October. A little bit over 1 year from launching, we were acquired by Yahoo and moved down to California from Vancouver, Canada, where we were based. Millionth user in July that same year. Launched a feature called Interestingness, and I'll talk about the general underpinnings of this a little bit more. But the idea here was that we could rank search results based on the people's implicit feedback to how interesting a photo was. So if people add a comment or add a photo as a favorite, if there's a title and description and tags, all that we can count as making the photo more interesting. And you can do slightly more sophisticated things too. So if your mom comments on your photo, that doesn't count as much as if a stranger counts on your photo. 2 millionth photo in December of that year. The 100 millionth photo, February 2006. We launched Gamma, a new version of the site. Added geotagging, also 2006, 250 millionth photo. And this goes on up to about today, where the most recent hallmark was the 4 billionth photo. So all of this takes place against a background of a bunch of changes. And in many cases, you can attribute a particularly successful decision we made at Flickr to something that was just us being in the right place at the right time. On the left, you can see the Kodak Brownie camera, which was the first consumer camera. Consumer photography since the introduction of the Brownie in 1920 until about 2001 or so was very explicitly about memory preservation. So people would take photos at significant life events. So a wedding, a graduation, birth of a new baby, a vacation, things like that. And the photos were taken to help people preserve the memory and they could look back at it in the future. Obviously, people still do that today, but there's an evolution towards using photography as a way of connecting with other people and communicating in general. So people do things like arrive at the airport and take a camera phone picture of the baggage claim to let their loved ones know they got there safely, or they take a photo of the funny or sexy or interesting thing they saw on the way to work. These are a couple of examples. I actually do the should I get these shoes if I'm in the shoe store, because I'm not authorized to make my own shoe buying decisions. So we sometimes ask around the office, what is Flickr for? And the internal kind of joke answer is it's for photos of sunsets and babies, kittens, and flowers, because those are like the 4 big categories of usage, 4 big categories of photos that people enjoy uploading and sharing. But we had to come up with a vision statement once we were acquired by Yahoo. This is a big company thing, and I had never worked at a big company before. And we had a series of meetings, and it was determined that we had to come up with a vision statement. At the time, it seemed like kind of a useless thing for us to do, but it turned out to be very valuable, because what we came up with was Flickr should be the eyes of the world. So the primary place where what people see is reflected back out to them. And just judging by the number of photos available and searchable on the site, that's been very successful. Thanks. So not long after we launched, and obviously over the course of the last 5 years, we've seen a lot of that eyes of the world behavior. This is one of the first photos I remember being picked up widely by wire services. This is at the CGP protests in Paris in 2006. And the photos taken by Flickr users of that event were as good, and in some cases better, than the photos being taken by Reuters and AP and Agency France Presse and the other wire service agencies. So we started to see a lot of that. Here's another one, more recent, this last, I think, March or April at the G20 summit in London. So obviously a lot of very good photography. But the first time we saw this was in September of 2004. And that was the Australian embassy in Jakarta being bombed. Now, at the time, Flickr had 60,000 users compared to 40 million today. What was really interesting to me about this, not only that the first photo, this one, was uploaded to Flickr before the story was published on CNN.com, but the fact that 3 different people uploaded photos within about an hour of the bomb actually going off. And if you think about that, 60,000 people, the chances of 3 of them being in Jakarta and having their camera with them and having access to internet within an hour after the event and being able to capture that, it seems like pretty long odds. But that use case is multiplied. With 40 million people, at this point, anytime something photographable happens, anytime something newsworthy happens that could be photographed, it's photographed and put on Flickr right away. So we saw this the year following the bombings in the London Underground. There was thousands of photos within the first 15 minutes of the bombs going off. And over the course of the day, hundreds of thousands of photos, ranging from signs outside the school that say, please don't tell children about the bombing, to photos of people who live in London saying, I'm okay, to their friends and family. What was even more interesting is at that time, September 2004, again with only 60,000 users, it wasn't just the Jakarta bombing. There was all of these photos of Indonesia. In fact, even then, with such a small number of users, it was probably the best place to go to look at photos of Indonesia if you're interested in traveling there or wanting to learn more about the culture or history or geography. And that's even more true today. So, also at that time, this phrase got a lot more popularity, user-generated content. We heard this over and over again, businesses that were involved in user-generated content. And I absolutely hate this phrase for a couple of reasons. First is, when you think about content, it's information, entertainment, educational materials, but it's the things that fill up broadcast hours or column inches. So you have some sort of vessel as a broadcaster or a publisher that you need to fill up with something. That something is content. From a business perspective, the content is there in order to sell advertising. So that phrase, user-generated content, has a very strong bias towards the business person's perspective on what is a deeply human, personal, and interpersonal activity. Because that's not what users are generating. If you look at their motivations for using something like Flickr, what they want is to create or improve their relationships with other people. They want to keep up with friends and family. They want to see a steady stream of the development of their cousin. I get that quite a bit. I have a nephew who's now, I think, 5 years old, and his mother has been posting photos since he was about 1, almost every day. So even though I don't see him in real life more than maybe once a year or so, I can see him put the recycling can on his head or take all the books off the floor and keep up with his life. Another big reason for people to post public photos is because they want some recognition or acknowledgement. It's look at this, what a good photographer I am, or people sharing their art. And of course there's also people promoting some view that they have, some view on the world, from peace-loving Baha'is to people promoting political change. And just like user-generated content isn't a great phrase, social media isn't either, at least in one sense of the word. In English, we use media in 2 pretty different ways. The first is the older and more generic term, media as the place in which something happens or the place through which something happens. So we say that air is the media for sound because sound is vibrations in the air. We also use the word media to refer to publishing and broadcasting very specifically. A form of business, or if you like, one of the pillars of society. But when we use the phrase social media in the second way, we're thinking again, just as business people, replacing something that we used to hire professionals to do. In other words, take photographs or videos or write or act or present. and instead getting people to do that for free. I think using social media in the first sense is a lot more interesting. Suddenly we have a medium through which we as human beings can communicate, and that medium is fundamentally social. Since the early days of the internet, the most interesting applications have always been the ones that allow people to communicate with each other, as opposed to taking something like television and putting it on the web, or taking something like music and putting it on the internet. It's much more powerful to allow people to connect. So with Flickr specifically, there was 3 trends that I think made a big difference. One was, this is not a great way to say it, but the ubiquity of capture devices. In other words, how many cameras there were in the world. Suddenly, with the pocket-sized point-and-shoot digital cameras, they were small enough to fit in the pocket of your coat or in your purse or your laptop bag. And of course, even more importantly, most people suddenly had a camera with them all the time because they had a camera built into their phone. The second one is the spread of the network. So it's not that easy to remember sometimes, but 10 years ago, most people didn't have an internet connection at home, even in the richest and most connected countries. They had internet connections at work, a small minority had connections at home, but now most people in most developed nations have internet connections at home, and in fact most people have internet connections in their pocket. It goes with them wherever they go. The most important and interesting trend, though, is the change in perceptions and attitudes. So if you looked at a newspaper or cartoon depicting an internet user in 1998, it would be a fat man in the basement, kind of hunched over a computer, and anyone who used the internet for social purposes was automatically creepy or deviant or weird. No one would ever, at that time, admit to using an online dating service. Any use of chat or instant messaging, any kind of social activity was assumed to be somehow deviant. And that's been an enormous change in society. Now, probably everyone in this room has either used an online dating service or knows someone who has. And the sight of a grandparent and a grandchild instant messaging with each other doesn't seem strange or foreign at all. So you put these 2 first trends together, and you have the tools and means of participation. And with the second trend, we also see that the desire to participate has become a lot more widespread. And here's a really great example. This is now President Obama, then just a candidate in Berlin in 2008. This was a big event in the US, and in fact this photo taken by the Associated Press was on the front page of the New York Times. That's where I first came across it. And it's a great photo, but what's really interesting about it is as you zoom in closer and closer, you can see that almost every single person in the photo is holding a camera or some kind of recording device. In fact, you can see there's one person holding up their laptop trying to take a photo with that. And as you pan around and look at every different part, literally every single person, everywhere. In this photo, 44 cameras, 49 people. So it's cheating a little bit because not all these people are actually taking photos in order to share them broadly, but it's certainly an example of the change in how we collectively experience events. If you go to a concert now, you see this blue glow of the LCDs of everyone's cameras coming back at you. And if you look at the photos that were taken, because as soon as I saw this, the big photo in the New York Times, I went onto Flickr and did a search for Obama Berlin. Again, the photos are just as good as those taken by the AP and Reuters and Agency France Presse. They're very high quality. You also get this experience of what it's like in the audience. And again, the blue glow of the LCD of all those cameras almost everywhere you go. So we put all of those together. We have the desire to participate, we have the tools and means to participate. The opportunities for entrepreneurs and for people starting businesses in the user-generated content or social media categories really lie in empowering people to act on those desires. So here's some lessons from Flickr, and I'll go through these and then skip up to a slightly higher level. Going through them one at a time, you have to really mean it. And by that, I mean we engaged with the people who use Flickr in a way that was not typical of businesses interacting with their customers, or at least not as common as it should be, which is directly interacting and listening and putting individual people on the line. So it wasn't a Flickr spokesperson, it was STEWART Butterfield or George Oates or Katarina Fake, the actual people who worked there. This is a tough one for us because most of the people who worked on the Flickr team were obviously internet enthusiasts, engineers, and we would impress ourselves very easily. In other words, we were very impressed with the cool things we pulled off, especially technologically. But people don't really care about it. So this is a diagram, a very old one, of switching from one search system at Flickr to another. And people don't care about this at all. And you think about all the different technologies, many, many layers that are abstracted away. When someone types something to a search box and hits submit, they want to get good results back. And there's layers and layers and layers of things that we have to do. All of that disappears from the user's perspective. Third lesson, and this is probably the most important and the most interesting, is that you should make your mistakes as fast as you can. So I said earlier that the first version of Flickr was nothing like what you see today. That's because most of the things we did in the beginning were wrong. And if we didn't do the things that were wrong and recognize them, then we wouldn't have been able to do anything right. It's an interesting side note here. Traditionally, big companies have a hard time innovating because of this formula, that they don't want to have much effect from their failures. And there's two parameters: how much a failure costs them and what the likelihood of the failure occurring are. So most people concentrate on one variable there. That's the likelihood of failure. So in order to reduce the likelihood of failure, you take fewer risks. It's pretty obvious. What's interesting with the internet as a medium and businesses that are focused on the internet, the cost of failure is typically much higher. I mean, it's less high in an obvious way compared to manufacturing businesses. Because if you get into the business of actually manufacturing something, you've probably invested millions or tens of millions of dollars in engineering and prototypes and actually building out factories and producing real objects, each of which has a cost. On the other hand, people who are doing web-based startups can get something out, try it at a nominal cost. I mean, usually just the cost of employing the people working on the project. And if they're founders of a startup, then that's usually free. So they can bring the cost of failure very close to zero. And 0 times anything also equals 0. We see that a lot. And here's a very interesting example. We introduced a feature on Flickr so that people could create groups. In an old way of doing things, I mean, this almost doesn't apply, but an old way of doing things, we might have thought of the applications for groups in advance and dictated how groups should be structured in order to support those applications. So, in other words, we might think people will make groups because they're interested in black and white photography, or they're interested in portrait photography, and things like that. And actually, those are the things that we assumed people would make groups for. But people made groups for things that were totally off our map and we never would have anticipated. And the cost of proposing a group idea was 0. Someone using the service would create a group and invite people to it, and if people weren't interested, they wouldn't bother coming. But out of all those groups that didn't take off, there was a small number that were very successful. So here's one example, and this is how far off the map we actually saw groups becoming. The group was called Squared Circle, and it was I think it was about 3 weeks from when we launched the group feature to when people actually created this. And it's because we launched the ability to look at group photos in slideshows, and someone had the idea, it would be kind of cool if we looked at photos that were square in aspect ratio, and the contents of the photo were a circle, and the edges of the circle touch the edges of the square. And in fact, it does look kind of cool when you look at it in slideshow mode. This group got 10,000 users and about 100,000 photos. And in fact, it got so popular that one of the people who started the group wrote his own software to automatically log into the group and make sure the photos were actually square and make sure they actually had circular content by analyzing the photo. And if it didn't, it would kick it out automatically because the number of submissions was so high that they couldn't keep up with them manually. So another lesson, and this is a tough one for a lot of entrepreneurs, that whatever your idea is, the idea by itself is pretty much worthless. There's been very, very few ideas that intrinsically have caused the success of something. You have to implement and try it, get it out there in the world, and see how people react. The final lesson, the product should be its own marketing. And this is now getting pretty basic for most people involved in internet businesses. But in the case of Flickr, the primary source of marketing was people using Flickr and then posting photos to their blogs. And when you went to their blogs, you would click on the photo and be taken to Flickr. So we built a lot of features to support that. You could email a photo to Flickr and it would automatically upload it to the site and then log into your blogging software and post the photo there. We also had an open API and have somewhere in the neighborhood of 60,000 developers writing software that interoperates with Flickr. So this is just a couple of strategies as well. One is to make things massively multiplayer. Massively multiplayer is maybe just another phrase for participatory media, where people are actually the architects of the product's direction. The second one is to create an actual ecosystem that's through an open API. But if it's possible at all for other people to add value to your product, then you should enable that and support it. We've seen that again and again, not with the iPhone and the App Store, with Facebook and Facebook's applications, with Twitter and its API and all the different clients you can use for Twitter. And the last one is a different way of thinking about the media objects. They become a focal point for interaction. And a designer I met after I started work at Yahoo had a very nice way of saying it. He said that Flickr is a great place to be a photo. So if you're a photograph, you'd be very happy if you're on Flickr as opposed to being on someone's hard drive, unnoticed and unloved. And it's a different way of thinking than someone who's designing something in order for someone else to consume that media. Here's a little digression into Web 2.0 and one way of thinking about it. These are a bunch of phrases, and people tend to use Web 2.0, social media, and all these things more or less interoperably. A long time ago, if you wanted to listen to some music, the way to do that was to go downstairs in your house and get your family members together, and together you would play music. And that, doesn't really happen today. It does a little bit, but not so much, and it doesn't look quite so elegant. Part of the reason for this is, over the 20th century, the development of a lot of broadcast technologies. Phonograph, the radio, the moving pictures, television, and all those supported the development of this cult of celebrity, which we still have today. It also led to people specifically designing music as a product aimed at a particular demographic. And here's a perfect example. I can't remember if this band is called Whitesnake or Poison, but a big 80s hair band. And this idea of music as something for a particular audience who are going to purchase it, designed in a boardroom by music company executives, is very Web 1.0. Whereas in contrast, this is Web 2.0. 1.0, 2.0. One final note about Web 2.0 and all these changes. Over the last 5 years, almost 5 years now that we've been using that phrase, something really interesting happened. And this is the number of people using the web for social interaction, a chart stretching back to the early 90s. And this is about when I got online. Usenet, bulletin board systems, and email lists were the primary uses of the internet. There was a web, but it hadn't been popularized yet. It was the 1994 or so, where the web in itself started to become popular. And not long after that, the dot-com era, and the development of blogs, and the launch of Friendster, which was pretty significant back in 2003, MySpace shortly after, Facebook shortly after that, and then more recently things like World of Warcraft and Twitter. And if you look at the right side of that graph, obviously very much up and to the right, a real inflection point. I should also say that the graph is totally made up and not based on any data. But it doesn't matter because the point is still true. It's a very obvious and tangible change has occurred, especially in the last 2 or 3 years. When Friendster got to 1 million users, it was a big deal. Now we count Facebook's members in the hundreds of millions. And we thought that Flickr's rapid rise to popularity was something exceptional until we saw YouTube. And then YouTube adoption rate actually seemed pretty slow when you compare it to Twitter, which has taken off like nothing else before. All of that has made possible something very interesting to pretty much all the people on the planet, because everyone has interests. Now, I'm interested in food. Everyone likes food. Some people like watching TV. A lot of people like watching TV. But some people are interested in very specific things. So I also like German board games. And I like making bread from scratch by hand. And the chances that someone else will share some particular interest, like German board games or bread baking, is much smaller. And along with that, the chances that I'll have something in common with them and be interested in meeting them and hanging out with them are also much greater. And what the web has always been very good at is helping you find someone who shares those interests. So it doesn't matter if it's German board games and bread making, or if it's being a survivor of breast cancer, or a model train enthusiast, or any one of the billions of other things we could do. Prior to the web, it was very difficult to find that many model train enthusiasts or people who enjoyed playing German board games. The transaction costs were high because you could invest a lot of your time, like go to the coffee shop and put up a little poster that says, Tuesdays I'm having German board game night, please join me if you're interested in German board games. A lot of effort. Internet makes that trivial, makes that cost almost nothing. And so suddenly people can find each other. And this points to a real evolution in the role of computing in people's lives. It's funny to remember this, but there was a time when computer was a job title. So people's function was to come to the office and take ledgers and big sheets of numbers and do multiplication and do division. Now there's no point. I mean, there's no reason why a human would ever do complex arithmetic in their head. And the first widespread applications of computers in things like tabulating the census or doing accounting for large businesses were actually things that replaced human functions. But then there was this shift, and I remember it pretty vividly. I remember in the mid-90s going to my father's office. He's a real estate developer and shared an office with an architecture firm. And walking into the office, there's a receptionist and there's draftsmen who work at the architecture company, there's the architects, there's accountants, there's the business people, and every single one of them had a computer on their desk. Every single one of them now spent their day in front of a screen and a keyboard and a mouse and doing this. It's really a very interesting shift because 10 years ago, maybe the accountant had a computer, but no one else did. People sat in front of drawing tables or telephones. Actually, I don't even remember what people did because I barely worked at that time. And this shift I think, has picked up a lot of speed just in the last 5 or 6 years when you can really see a shift. The first shift was from application-based computing, where computers were designed and built for some specific application. The first ones were calculating the trajectory of missiles to see if you could shoot an airplane out of the sky, and this is very important, obviously, during the war. Later, computers were built for tabulating results in elections and the census, things like that. Then there was a shift to the more familiar model of computing that we're all familiar with, which is document-based computing, where you have a Word document or an image file and you double-click on it and a program opens up. But the locus of usage of your computer is all about documents. Now we see a different model, which is much more about relationships between people. And it's I'm, again, just making this data up, but it seems obviously true to me that most CPU cycles in the world are there to support people communicating with another. I mean, that's just trivially true from the number of CPUs that are in mobile phones and the prevalence of using mobile phones for daily communication. And this is really a very big leap for humanity. We've removed a lot of the necessity to be in the same place at the same time. Obviously, there's still great value. I mean, I flew all the way to Madrid to give this presentation rather than put up Skype video chat. But we've removed that necessity in order to communicate. And that means that any member of humanity can communicate with any other member of the species anywhere on the surface of the planet, more or less at the speed of light. And also, and this is probably more important, has made almost everything we've ever learned as a species available to anyone on demand. And we see the trivial use case of this all the time. I'm sure that most of you have been out to dinner with a friend and you get into a discussion of some famous person and you don't know whether they're alive or dead, so you look it up. Or you don't know what year it was that Holland beat Germany in the World Cup, so you look it up. Those are the trivial examples. The more significant examples are when I was 7 years old and had to do a report for school. You would go to the library and you'd meet the librarian and you would check out books and you'd sit there poring over books. Now if I want to know something about Vasco da Gama or Christopher Columbus, I can just go Google it. A few seconds later I have it. So I'm going to show a video now. So this is the audio time. This is just a few minutes long. It's very funny, and it also says something important in a way that I can't articulate it as well myself. So I'm going to switch it over to the video, and I'll come right back.
Yeah, those were simpler times, I think. I just feel like we may be going back to that, by the way. But in a way, good, because when I read things like the foundations of capitalism are shattering, I'm like, maybe we need that. Maybe we need some time where we're walking around with a donkey with pots clanging on the sides.
You think that would just bring us back to reality?
Yeah, because everything is amazing right now and nobody's happy. Like, in my lifetime, the changes in the world have been incredible. When I was a kid, we had a rotary phone. We had a phone that you had to stand next to, and you had to dial it.
Yes.
You realize how primitive? You're making sparks in a phone, and you actually would hate people with zeros in their numbers because it was more
right.
Like, oh, this guy's got 2 zeros. Screw that guy. Why do I want to? And then if they called and you weren't home, the phone would just ring lonely by itself. And then if you wanted money, you had to go in the bank when it was open for like 3 hours. You had to stay in line, write yourself a check like an idiot. And then when you ran out of money, you just go, well, I can't do any more things now.
Right.
I can't do any more things.
That's it, yeah.
That was it. And even if you had a credit card, the guy would go, ugh, and he'd bring out this whole shunk, and he'd write, you have to call the president to see if you have any money. And
it's all true, kids. You had to call the president, yeah. It was ridiculous.
Yes.
Do you feel that we now, in the 21st century, we take technology for granted?
Well, yeah, because now we live in an amazing, amazing world, and it's wasted on the crappiest generation of just spoiled idiots that don't care, because this is what people are like now. They got their phone, and they're like, it won't. Give it a second. It's going to space. Can you give it a second to get back from space? Is the speed of light too slow for you? Yeah. I was on an airplane, and there was internet, high-speed internet on the airplane. That's the newest thing that I know exists. And I'm sitting on the plane, and they go, open up your laptop, you can go on the internet. And it's fast, and I'm watching YouTube clips. I'm in an airplane. And then it breaks down, and they apologize, the internet's not working. The guy next to me goes, this is bull. Like how quickly the world owes him something he knew existed only 10 seconds ago.
Right.
And on planes, flying is the worst one because people come back from flights and they tell you their story. And it's like a horror story. They act like their flight was like a cattle car in the 40s in Germany. That's how bad they make it sound.
Right.
They're like, it was the worst day of my life. First of all, we didn't board for 20 minutes. And then we get on the plane, and they made us sit there on the runway for 40 minutes. We had to sit there. Oh, really? What happened next? Did you fly through the air incredibly like a bird? Did you partake in the miracle of human flight, you non-contributing zero, that you got to fly? You're flying! It's amazing. Everybody on every plane should just constantly be going, oh my God! Wow! Yes! You're flying. You're sitting in a chair in the sky.
Yes. Yeah. That's right. Now, Louis,
but it doesn't go back a lot. And it's not really, here's the thing. People, like they say there's delays on flights.
Yeah.
Delays, really? New York to California in 5 hours. That used to take 30 years to do that. And a bunch of you would die on the way there and have a baby. You'd be a whole different group of people by the time you got there. Now you watch a movie and you take a dump in your home.
Yeah. Nicer way to say it than that, but
No.
Okay, so I think I'm just about out of time, so I'll wrap this up quickly. If you want to find that clip again, it's called Everything's Amazing and Nobody's Happy, American comedian named C.K. Lewis on a late-night talk show. I want to pick up on one of the threads there, though. The technological changes really go unappreciated. If you think about the whole history of the universe, there was a spinning ball of gas congealed into Earth. Some kind of bugs arose, and then there was dinosaurs, and then there was something that resembles people today, and we have this whole pattern of evolution. And I think that the development of the internet, and specifically the development of the internet as a social medium, is as important as any technological change we've ever undergone as a species. Just like the development of language, which allowed the wisdom and knowledge and experience of parents to be able to pass down to children, or on a par with events like the development of agriculture or the domestication of animals, the division of labor, the development of the printing press. All of those things made a fundamental shift to the way we operate as a species on the surface of the Earth. And the internet is on a par with those and probably isn't nearly as appreciated. So I'll leave you with this thought. Commonly attributed to a futurist named Paul Sappho, but actually goes back a little bit further. Well-known axiom for some psychologists and economists that we routinely overestimate the short-term effects of a technological change. So you could see that in, say, 1998. There was very successful dot-com businesses, and suddenly everyone freaked out and thought by 2002 all the old businesses would be dead and they'd be replaced by these new ones. The flip side of that is that we also underestimate the long-term effects of technological change. And I think that we're still underestimating the significance of the development of digital technologies, digital content, the internet, social media, user-generated content. This is a change that will make the lives of our great-great-great-grandchildren as different as our lives today are from our great-great-great-grandparents. And with that, since I'm a few minutes over time, I'll thank you very much for being a wonderful audience and listening. Thank you.